Wyoming Territory, May of 1879. The wind was dry, the pines still, and blood soaked the soil beneath the cottonwoods. Evelyn Whitlow had not meant to stray that far from her family's homestead. But the creek behind the bluff had always been her quiet place, and this morning, needing peace more than ever, she had gone there with a basket of bread and a mind full of worries. Her father had passed the previous winter, and the weight of keeping the house fed, her younger brother safe, and their land from being swallowed by the bank had not let up. She heard the faint groan before she saw him. It took a few seconds for her eyes to catch the shape slumped against a fallen log. At first her heart thudded with fear. A man, badly hurt, rifle nowhere in sight, his chest rising shallow and uneven. Her feet moved before her thoughts did. His skin was sun-warmed copper, hair long and dark and tangled with blood. A Cheyenne, young, maybe late 20s, and wearing the remnants of a battle. His shirt was torn, his arm pressed uselessly to his side, soaked red. His face was drawn tight with pain, but when she knelt beside him, his eyes opened, dark brown, sharp, alert even then. "You need help," Evelyn said, voice steady though her hands trembled. He did not answer. His gaze flicked to the basket, then back to her face, wariness thick as smoke. "I will not hurt you, I swear it." His voice was gravel and breath. "You should go. Too late for that," she muttered, already tearing her shawl into strips. "You will bleed out if I do." She worked fast. She had never tended a wound this bad before, but she had watched her father patch up injured horses, and once a trapper who had taken a shot to the leg. She washed the blood away with water from her canteen, found the bullet dug just under the skin near his ribs. He clenched his jaw but did not cry out when she dug it out with her knife. "What is your name?" she asked as she packed the wound. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Mekko, I'm Evelyn." He nodded once, sweat beading on his brow. She stayed with him as the sun rose and dipped low again. When he could not stand, she dragged him slowly, painfully across the field, behind the trees, into the small root cellar behind her house where no one would look. Her 11-year-old brother Henry was gone for 2 days helping a neighbor brand cattle. She had time. That night she sat beside the cellar door, listening to his shallow breathing below, her hands stained with dried blood. She did not sleep. By the next morning, Mekko was conscious enough to eat a little bread. He said little, but when he did speak, his voice had strength. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Evelyn poured water into a tin cup. "Because someone should. There are others who would leave me to die." She met his eyes. "Well, I am not them." The days passed slow. Evelyn tended the wound, cleaned it twice daily, and kept a sharp ear out for anyone nearby. Mekko spoke only when necessary. She learned he had been attacked by a group of white scouts near the southern ridge. He had been traveling alone, trying to reach the Powder River. He had not expected to be hunted. "I was not fighting," he said one evening, his voice low as the firelight flickered through the slats overhead. "I was only going home." Evelyn sat quietly, her knees pulled to her chest. "I believe you." He glanced at her, something soft flickering in his eyes. By the 5th day, Mekko could sit up. She moved him into the shed beside the barn, safer now that Henry had returned, and started asking questions. She told her brother she was working on a sick dog. Mekko helped her when he could, cutting wood, husking corn, keeping his movements slow and careful. Evelyn caught him watching her sometimes. When she smiled, he looked away quickly. One morning he asked, "Why are you alone here?" She was quiet for a moment. "Our father died in December. Fever. Mama died when I was 13. It is just me and Henry now." "I am sorry," she nodded. "Thank you." That night a storm rolled in. The wind howled around the eaves, and Evelyn could not sleep. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and walked to the shed. Mekko was awake, sitting on the ground, watching the rain through a crack in the wall. "I thought maybe you would be cold," she said, setting down another blanket. He looked up at her, his face lit only by the lantern she carried. "You should not be out in this." "I have weathered worse," she said, settling beside him. "Besides, you looked like you needed company." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind. "I owe you my life," he said finally. "I do not want a debt." "Then what do you want?" Her voice caught. She had not let herself think about that for a long time. I do not know, maybe just someone who sees me. He turned to her slowly. I see you. She looked at him then, really looked the lines of his face, the scar near his temple, the quiet steadiness in his eyes. I see you too, she whispered. Neither of them moved, but the air between them shifted. There was something there now, unspoken but real. Over the next week, Evelyn found herself drawn to him more with every day. Mekko was quiet but not cold. He listened when she spoke, really listened. He helped with the chores once he grew stronger, kept Henry company in the evenings without needing to say much. One afternoon, as they were splitting wood, Evelyn slipped and barked her shin hard against a log. Mekko caught her before she fell. His hands were strong, steady, calloused. You should be careful, he said, voice low. I am trying, she said, looking up at him. His gaze lingered on her lips before he stepped back. That night, she could not stop thinking about it. By the end of the second week, Mekko's wound had healed enough for him to walk without pain. But Evelyn's heart clenched tighter with every step he took toward recovery. You will be leaving soon, she said one evening as they stood at the edge of the creek. Yes, she nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. I am glad you are well, he turned to her. I do not want to leave without saying something. Her chest tightened. What? He stepped closer. You gave me more than safety. You gave me something I did not think I would find again. What is that? Hope, she swallowed hard. I do not want you to go. I do not want to either. He reached up, brushing a piece of hair from her cheek. His touch was gentle. Then stay, she whispered. He kissed her soft, slow, sure. And just like that, the world shifted again. 3 days after the kiss by the creek, a wagon came up the ridge from the south, canvas bowed, oxen slow, a man and woman riding up front. Evelyn spotted it from the barn roof where she had been mending a broken shingle. She climbed down quick, heart kicking against her ribs, and found Mekko near the corral, checking the latch on the gate. Strangers coming, she said, brushing dust from her palms. 2 of them, heading this way. Mekko didn't ask questions. He moved with calm purpose, stepping inside the barn without a word and closing the door behind him. Evelyn unhitched the rifle from the hook on the porch and leaned it against the wall, visible but untouched. She didn't want to scare anyone, just be clear. The wagon rolled into the yard as the sun hung low, casting long bands of gold across the pasture. The man on the bench had a weathered face, gray streaking his beard, and the woman beside him wore a shawl over her shoulders despite the heat. They looked tired, not dangerous. The man raised a hand. Even in, miss, we're looking for the Louises. Heard they had a well out this way. They moved east last spring, Evelyn said. You're 2 weeks behind 'em, the woman sighed. We figured as much. Evelyn stepped forward. You're welcome to fill your canteens here. The well's behind the house. The man nodded, tipping his hat. Appreciate it kindly. While they watered their animals, Evelyn brought out a jar of pickled beans and a loaf of rye that hadn't come out quite right. It was more than she could spare, but something about their worn-down quiet reminded her of winter nights by the fire when her father had made space at the table for travelers. The woman looked up from rinsing her hands. You live here alone. My brother's inside, Evelyn said, careful. He's young. The woman's eyes softened. You're doing a brave thing, miss. God bless you. They stayed less than an hour. When the wagon turned back toward the road, Evelyn watched it out of sight before walking back to the barn. Mekko stood just inside the door, arms folded, gaze steady. You were calm. I had to be. They could have seen me. They didn't. He hesitated before saying, You could have turned me in that first day. Evelyn leaned against the frame, arms crossed. I didn't. He looked at her then, not with suspicion, but something quieter, curious, almost hesitant. Why didn't you? She shrugged one shoulder. I don't think every man with long hair and a wound is a threat. He studied her face like he was trying to read something deeper in it. You were afraid at first, I could see it. I was afraid of losing another person, she said, voice low. Not of you. Mekko stepped closer, slow, cautious. You've lost many, I've lost enough. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, When I was 12, my sister died in winter. Fever took her quick. My mother never spoke of her again. Evelyn looked at him, surprised. Why are you telling me? Because I want you to know me. She felt something shift in her chest, a small, quiet loosening. That night, Henry asked her why she was smiling while slicing turnips. She didn't answer. The next morning, Mekko brought her a woven bracelet. It was made from grass and cotton thread, knotted tight and simple. He handed it to her without ceremony. I used to make these as a boy. It keeps away bad dreams. She slid it onto her wrist. Then I'll wear it always. Evelyn's sleep came easier after that. By mid-June, the days grew long and hot. The roof needed rethatching, and the fence along the back pasture had started to sag. Mekko worked beside her without needing direction, his movements sure and unhurried. Henry had taken to him in quiet ways, asking his opinion on where to dig the next post hole, watching him sharpen blades. One evening, Evelyn found Mekko alone by the smokehouse, sitting on the overturned salt barrel, his gaze turned east. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, stepping close. "My uncle, he used to say the wind carries the voices of those who remember you." She sat beside him. "Do you think he's still listening?" "I hope so." They were quiet a while, then she said, "I don't know what happens next." "I stay," he said. She looked at him, startled by the certainty in his tone. "I stay," he repeated, "if you want that." Evelyn reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his. "I do." He turned his palm, closing his around hers. The stars came out one by one, and the wind stirred through the cottonwoods like a hush. Inside the house, Henry lit the lamp and set the table for three. The first frost came early that year, dusting the grass with silver and stiffening the hinges on the barn gate. Evelyn had pulled the root vegetables weeks before, but the beans were late ripening, so she and Mekko worked quickly in the fading light, pulling the last of them from the vines. He didn't wear gloves, even though the air had turned sharp, and when she glanced at his hands, she noticed the small cuts, the rawness along his knuckles. "You'll wear your skin through," she said, passing him a handful of pods. He glanced down, then back at her. "It will grow back." She knelt beside him, brushing dirt from beneath her nails, voice low. "You don't always have to be the one who endures." Mekko didn't answer at first. He tied off the sack beside them, his movements careful. "It's what I was taught." Evelyn rested her forearms on her knees, studying the way his eyes stayed on the horizon. "What else were you taught?" He drew in a long breath. "That quiet is stronger than shouting, that you leave a place better than you found it. And that every kindness carries risk." She looked at him, her voice quiet. "Do you regret this one?" He turned toward her then, and the question settled between them like a held breath. "No." Later, when the beans were hung and the sun had gone, Henry sat in the barn with an old slate, scratching figures into the surface. Mekko passed by and paused beside him. "You learning numbers?" he asked. Henry nodded without looking up. "Miss Evelyn says I'll need them if we're gonna keep the land." Mekko crouched beside him. "She's right. Did you learn them too, in my own way?" Henry looked up. "Can you show me?" Mekko nodded, and they sat there, heads bent together in the dim light, the boy's voice steady and curious, the man's patient. Evelyn watched from the porch steps, a folded quilt in her lap, heart full in a way that made her eyes sting. The next morning, she found Mekko in the lean-to behind the smokehouse, working on something with cedar shavings scattered at his feet. He didn't speak when she approached, just handed her the object quietly, a spoon, carved smooth and shaped with care, the handle etched with a pattern of slanted lines. "I had no gift for you," he said simply. She ran her fingers over the grain. "This is more than enough. Cedar's good for winter." "It doesn't crack easy." Evelyn held the spoon in both hands. "Neither do I." They stood there for a moment, the quiet between them no longer hesitant but known. That afternoon, a letter arrived from the county office, delivered by a rancher riding north. Evelyn opened it on the porch while Mekko and Henry fixed the gatepost. Her eyes moved over the neat, formal script, and her breath caught halfway through. She walked to the fence, paper trembling slightly in her grip. They approved the land title transfer. "It's ours now." Henry let out a shout and dropped the hammer, running to her. Mekko met her eyes over the boy's head, his expression unreadable. That night, when Henry had gone to bed and the fire was low, Evelyn and Mekko sat on the floor in front of the hearth, a blanket pulled around their shoulders. She traced the edge of the spoon with her thumb. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said. He looked at the flames. "Safety comes from who you build it with," she turned to him. "Then I want to build it with you." His hand found hers beneath the blanket, fingers warm against her wrist. "I thought I was walking alone," he said. "But I was only waiting." Evelyn leaned into him, her voice no louder than the crackle of the fire. "You're not waiting anymore." He kissed her then, slow and steady, and the world narrowed to the warmth between them. The wind outside moved through the pines, but in the house, there was only quiet, and the soft rhythm of two hearts finding the same pace. By the end of the week, Mekko had built a second bed frame from pine he felled himself. He set it beside Evelyn's in the loft, not touching but close enough to hear her breathing in the dark. She reached for his hand across the narrow space, and he met her halfway. They didn't speak that night. They didn't need to. October settled into the valley with a hush, no snow yet, but the air held its breath. The leaves along the creek were turning gold and rust, and the deer moved slower through the brush. Evelyn stood at the edge of the hayfield, the hem of her dress damp with frost, watching the last of the crows rise from the bare cottonwood branches. Mekko was repairing the chicken coop, his jacket tied around his waist, sleeves rolled high. A rabbit had burrowed beneath the rotting boards, and 2 hens had gone missing since dawn. Evelyn crouched beside him, handing over nails from her apron pocket. "You ever keep animals before?" she asked, brushing sawdust from her skirt. He tapped a nail into place. "No, but I've hunted them." "Helps to know how they think." She tilted her head. "What does a chicken think?" He set the hammer down. "Not much, just enough to run when something's coming." Evelyn laughed, the sound surprising them both. She hadn't laughed like that in months. Mekko looked at her, his eyes warming. "Henry's been asking if we'll get a mule," she said, tone softening. "He wants to stop borrowing from the Kleins." Mekko pushed the board into place. "You could trade for one after the frost. I'll go with you." "You think they'd trade fair with you beside me?" He met her gaze. "They will if they know we're together." She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "It's not the same for you being seen here." "No," he said, "but I'd rather be seen beside you than hidden." That night, she found him in the loft, shaping thin strips of leather by lamplight. He was making a sling for Henry's pocketknife, the boy's initials stitched in thread along the fold. Evelyn sat beside him without speaking, and he passed her a strip to hold. "Did you ever think about settling somewhere?" she asked, watching the way his fingers moved. "Before this, I thought about land," he said, "not houses, a place where my people wouldn't be moved again, but even that." He trailed off. She didn't press. Instead, she said, "I used to think about Missouri. My mother was born there. I imagined it warmer, greener. But I don't anymore." Mekko looked at her, setting the needle aside. "Why not? Because everything I need is here." He reached across the space between them, brushing his hand against hers. "You gave me a place when I had none. That's not something I forget." She turned her palm to his, letting their fingers rest together on the floorboards, quiet between them, stretching gentle and full. By the next week, the mule had been found, an old dun mare with a limp, but steady on hills. The Kleins were willing to part with her in exchange for 2 sacks of dried beans and the rifle Evelyn's father had left behind. She made the trade without flinching. When she brought the mule home, Henry danced in the yard, naming her Daisy before the harness was even off. "She's half blind," Evelyn told him, brushing the animal's neck, "but she listens well." "She's perfect," Henry said, grinning. "Mekko can teach me to ride her." From the porch, Mekko said, "Tomorrow. After the chores." That night, Evelyn lit a second lamp in the loft and laid out the ledger her father had kept. The pages were worn, the ink faded in places, but the entries told the shape of their life bushels counted, debts settled, births and deaths marked alongside planting seasons. Mekko sat beside her, reading over her shoulder. "You've kept it going," he said. "I tried, but I think I want to start a new one." He looked at her. "From when?" "From now." She pulled a blank book from the drawer, one she'd saved since spring, and opened it to the first page. Then she handed him the pencil. "Write the first line." Mekko hesitated, then bent over the paper. His handwriting was slow, but even he passed it back. Evelyn read the words, her breath catching. "This land is ours." She closed the book and held it to her chest, eyes shining. Outside, the wind moved low through the grass, winter's edge drawing near. But inside, the warmth held steady, and the home they were building had roots now, deeper than weather, wide enough for all three of them. The air on the mountain turned sharp by mid-November, and the sun slipped behind the ridge earlier each day. Evelyn noticed how Mekko's right shoulder stiffened when he lifted the bucket from the well, how he favored his side when he carried the feed sack. She didn't say anything until they were alone in the cellar, sorting through the last of the preserved jars. "You've been aching more," she said, wiping dust from her palms. "It'll ease," Mekko said, voice low. "I've got willow bark steeped already." "You don't need to bear it just to prove something." He turned a jar in his hand, pickled beets, the wax seal still intact. "I know," she watched him a long moment. "Let me help next time," he didn't argue. That night, Henry spent the evening sketching the mule's ears in the margin of his spelling primer. Evelyn sat beside the fire, mending a tear in her shawl, while Mekko shaped a loop of rawhide into a belt strap. The quiet was warm, unforced. When the lamp burned low, Evelyn leaned toward him. "Will you come with me to the trading post next week?" He looked up. "You sure? I want the neighbors to see us. As we are." He nodded, and his hand brushed lightly against hers on the quilt. The trip to the trading post took nearly the whole day. The trail was packed hard and brittle with frost, and the mule's steps were slow but steady. Henry rode up front, bundled in his coat, holding the sack of dried apples they meant to trade. Evelyn walked beside the wagon, and Mekko kept to her right, shoulders squared, gaze steady. At the post, a few heads turned when they stepped inside. The air smelled of tobacco and old coffee. Evelyn kept her voice calm as she asked for flour and lamp oil, her chin lifted. The storekeep, a man called Ellis, narrowed his eyes for just half a moment before nodding and setting the goods on the counter. As he wrapped the flour, he said, "You've got good help, Miss Whitlow." Mekko didn't speak, but Evelyn met Ellis's gaze square. "He's not help. He's family." Ellis paused, paper crinkling in his hands. Then he gave a stiff nod and rang up the trade. Outside, Henry was feeding the mule a piece of carrot. Evelyn handed Mekko the oil tin. "You didn't have to say that," he said. "I wanted to." He looked down at her, the corner of his mouth barely lifting. "Then I'll say it too, when it's time." The sun was low when they climbed the ridge home. Evelyn's hands were cracked from the cold, but her heart felt settled in a way it hadn't before. 2 nights later, Henry came down with chills. Evelyn sat by his cot with a cool rag, and Mekko brewed a tea from elderflower and dried pine needles. The fever broke by morning, and Henry was up by noon, asking for honey. Evelyn rested her head against the doorframe, watching him eat with both hands. "You're not afraid anymore," Mekko said from behind her. She turned. "I still worry, but it's not the same. I'm not alone in it." He stepped closer, brushing his thumb across her temple. "Neither am I." Winter came in earnest the following week. Snow fell in slow, steady veils, and the trees bowed under its weight. Evelyn and Mekko chopped wood until the pile reached past Henry's shoulders. At night they sat close by the hearth, the boy asleep in his cot, the wind pressing gentle against the shutters. One evening, as the snow fell thick beyond the windows, Evelyn opened the cedar box she kept beneath the bed and pulled out a folded piece of muslin. "This was my mother's," she said, laying it across her lap. "She used it when she married my father. It's not much, but I thought." Mekko reached out and took her hand. "I don't need much, just you." She met his gaze. "Then let's not wait." 2 days later, they stood by the creek, the same place where she'd found him months ago. The snow had hushed everything, and the pines stood solemn and still. Henry held the muslin between them, and Evelyn's voice did not tremble as she spoke. "I choose you," she said. "Without fear, without question, with all I have." Mekko took her hands. "I walk beside you from this day until the last." They kissed beneath the white canopy of trees, and the world felt full and quiet and right. In the spring, daisies came up in the pasture, and Henry built a scarecrow with a crooked hat. The mule had a foal, small and soft-eyed, and Evelyn laughed when it followed her through the rows. Mekko carved a new spoon each week, not because they needed them, but because she liked the way his hands worked the wood. One morning, she found him by the porch, fitting a cedar box with a sliding lid. Inside lay the ledger they had started together, alongside the bracelet, the belt strap, and the first spoon. He looked up. "So we'll remember." Evelyn stepped beside him, resting her hand over his. "We don't need the things to remember." "No," he said. "But it's good to keep them." She leaned into him, her voice quiet. "Everything I hoped for is here." He pulled her close, and together they looked out over their land where the fence held, the roof no longer leaked, and the days stretched ahead, wide and waiting. They were home.